George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, but I'm also Chairman of Humanities West, and that's what we're doing here tonight. So we have one of our 4 programs this year on our 2024-2025 season for Humanities West. This one is done with the Italian Cultural Institute. Alberta Lai, the executive director, is right here, and this actually was her idea, this program, which was a great idea. And we have, the Italian Cultural Institute has brought from France Gabriella Dato, who's here to speak. But first we're going to hear from Kip Cranna, who all of you know at Humanities West. We're going to be talking about, Puccini. It's his 100th anniversary of his death. We're not going to be talking about his death. We're talking about, I thought the title was kind of nice, Arias from Heaven. I mean, that's the way you feel about his arias, but he's been dead for 100 years, so. Tonight, this is the second, as I said, of our season. I'll tell you what our next 2 upcoming programs are for Humanities West. In early February, we have Hannibal's Carthage. One of our speakers is here today, Douglas Kenning. And we have Patrick Hunt from Stanford speaking on that. That was a program that we were going to do in 2020. Something got in the way. So we're bringing that back. And then April 30th and May 2nd, 2-day, we'll have 2 evening program. We call it Lessons Unlearned, the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War. And we have 6 historians coming in, 3 on one night, 3 on another night. We'll have Q&A both nights, so we're going to do it right on the last day of the war, April 30th, 50 years earlier, and then 2 nights later. So we'll be doing that, and that's our big program for the year. And then, of course, we've already got the next season almost planned, but not quite. So how many of you here are, Humanities West, from pre-pandemic times? How many people have been coming to Humanities West since long ago? Yes, Kip, absolutely. No, that's great. It's great to see everybody keep coming. We hope that our a little dance in moving us here and bringing it down to 2 hours so that we could do it, and then live streaming it, because I know we have a live stream at home. We have a lot of people that went to Humanities West a lot that now watch from home, having learned how to do that during the pandemic, and it's very comfortable. So welcome everyone, and tonight we're going to start with Kip Cranna speaking about Puccini in his youth, how he got started. So thank you very much, Kip.
Thank you, George. Thanks, George. Am I on? Here we go. Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be back at Humanities West and back at the Commonwealth Club in this great facility. And I'm very honored to be on the same program with Gabriella Dato, who I'm sure has forgotten more about Puccini than I will ever know. But I'm trusting him to correct me if I make any mistakes, and he's sbagli, as the Italians would say. I do love talking about Puccini, and I have taught about him many times. In fact, I'm starting a class in April, a 6-week class on Puccini for the adult extension program at San Francisco State. So, and in preparing my talks about Puccini, I found that what interested me a great deal was the early years, the formative years, the childhood, the adolescence, the early adulthood, the formation of this incredible operatic genius. So that's what I'm talking about today. So as you can see, my talk is Puccini Before Fame, the composer in his youth. And as George mentioned, we're commemorating the 100th anniversary of the death of Puccini. There's his death mask there. He died at the age of 65 in 1924 after an unsuccessful operation in Belgium for lung cancer. He had been a lifelong smoker. But I'm not focusing on the end of his life. That will be more for Gabriella. He's going to talk about Puccini in the media age. I'm focusing on the early years, and I'd like to start with this little conversation between the British composer Benjamin Britten and the Russian composer Dmitri Shostakovich. So Shostakovich said, "What do you think of Puccini?" And Britten said, "I think his operas are dreadful." Shostakovich said, "No, Ben, you're wrong. He wrote marvelous operas, but dreadful music." So this reflects an attitude that I was aware of when I was in college in the 60s and grad school in the 70s. And Puccini, amongst intellectual circles, academia, he was thought of sort of déclassé. He was so popular, he pandered to the masses, he tugged at our heartstrings and played with our emotions. What's not to like about that, I would say. Fortunately now, Puccini's reputation has been rehabilitated and he remains incredibly respected and admired, I think, in the opera world. And every year when we do surveys about the number of operas that are performed annually, globally, his operas are always in the top 10. So there are, in my view, two really important sides to Giacomo Puccini. One is the soaring lyricism, which is often connected with the sentimentality that he has sometimes been criticized for. And the other aspect is the supercharged drama and emotion. You are all familiar with this example of the soaring lyricism. You're familiar with this from commercials and soundtracks. And this is the supercharged drama, the death of Scarpia in Tosca. So throughout the works of Puccini, we see these two elements, the soaring lyricism, the supercharged drama, sometimes combined, sometimes one predominating over the other. Puccini's operas somewhat fit into the classification we would call verismo. Not all of them neatly fit into that category. La Bohème, for example, certainly does not. The two operas I'm going to talk about tonight certainly do. Verismo is an outgrowth of a French literary movement called realism, or naturalism rather. A believable everyday reality was the important emphasis. Supercharged drama that we've just been talking about, non-heroic and non-idealistic subjects, so we're not dealing with emperors and kings and queens anymore. Violence and heightened emotions, sometimes not only emotional violence, but physical violence. Scenes and people from everyday life, vocal exertion, heavier voices in this repertoire, larger orchestras, triple winds rather than double, so 3 flutes rather than 2, 3 oboes, 3 bassoons, etc. No ornamentation in this style. And the arias often don't end there. The composers didn't leave a place for applause. In some situations now, audiences more or less insist on applauding, so we stop anyway. These are the Puccini operas. There are only 12. He was not incredibly prolific, and this is counting the 3 operas of his triple bill, Il Trittico, as one each. And you see from the ages that he was when these operas premiered, there are gaps. It took him anywhere from 3 to 6 years between operas. He was not cranking them out at a really rapid rate. This is his birthplace, Lucca, December 22nd, 1858. He has a birthday coming up here shortly. Many of you, I'm sure, have been to Lucca. Have you walked the walls? Yeah, that's the thing to do when you go to Lucca, these incredibly broad walls you could walk along. There's his birthplace, which is a museum now. You see a statue of him there in front of it. Now, this is what Italy looked like when he was born, the 1850s. It was not a unified country, a series of kingdoms and principalities, mostly under foreign domination, mostly by Austria. There is where Lucca is, in the northern part of Tuscany. These are his parents, Michele and Albina. He was one of their 9 children. It was a very musical family. And this is where his father worked. He was the Maestro di Cappella, the chapel master at the Cathedral of San Martino. There's the organ there, and we have to note that Puccini's father died when he was only 5, and he was instructed by this man that we see there, Fortunato Maggi. There's the interior of the cathedral, where Puccini was a choir boy in his youth. And he went to school here, San Michele Seminary School in Lucca. And here's an early report card. He comes into class merely to wear out the seat of his trousers. He pays not the slightest attention to anything and continually pretends to play on his desk as though it were a piano. So, obviously musically inclined at an early age. He entered the Istituto Pacini, now called Istituto Boccherini, in Lucca in 1874 at age 15. Boccherini was a famous cellist, so you see him there, the statue of him outside the institution. He also, during this period, played the piano at the Caffè Caselli, which is now called the Caffè di Simo. I would love to have been there to hear him play. And at the age 16, he wrote what we think is his earliest known composition, unless Ricordi has discovered something since this information was compiled. It's called A Te, or To You. And in it, we're going to see a good example of what the Italians called rubato, robbed, actually. The temporary disregarding of strict tempo to allow an expressive quickening or slackening, usually without altering the overall pace. In other words, mainly it's slowing down on high notes. And you'll see what I mean as we listen to this, A Te, Puccini's earliest known composition at age 16. Here comes our rubato. Once again. Age 16, I would say he was showing some promise. 1876, the Teatro Nuovo in Pisa presented Giuseppe Verdi's Aida. And Puccini went. He walked the 17 miles on foot, or the 19 miles rather, at age 17. There's where Lucca is, and you see Pisa there. I'm sure anyone who goes to Lucca almost always goes to Pisa as well. I remember catching a bus to do that. So at this point, he resolves to become an opera composer. His teacher was Carlo Angeloni, who taught him harmony and counterpoint. Most people understand what we mean by harmony, but often not by counterpoint. And I used to break people up into groups and make them sing Row, Row, Row Your Boat, but I got these guys to do it for me.
Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Row your boat merrily, 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 gently down the stream.
So you get the idea. It's a subject matter. In counterpoint, it's called a subject. It's a theme. It's a tune that is introduced by one voice. Another voice takes it up, and another voice takes it up, and they all have to fit together, these various iterations of the same tune. Counterpoint fugue subjects can be manipulated in various ways. You can have the normal form that we were just listening to. You can have augmentation, where the notes are longer, diminution, they're shorter, inversion, where the theme is upside down, so where the theme went up originally, it goes down, and vice versa. Retrograde, where you literally play the theme backwards from the last note to the first, and then retrograde inversion, where you turn it upside down and backwards, as if you'd taken the page of music and really turned it upside down. So if we look at this little theme, Mary had a little lamb, little lamb, little lamb, we thought that was our fugue subject. I could slow it down, Mary had, and so forth. That would be our augmentation, diminution, Mary had a little lamb, and so forth. Inversion, where it goes up in the original goes down in the inversion and vice versa. So instead of Mary had a little lamb, little lamb, little lamb, it's Mary had a little lamb, little lamb, little lamb, all right? And the retrograde starts at the end, da 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 dee da da dee da da da. And the retrograde inversion is upside down and backwards. So da 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 dee da 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 da. They become sort of unrecognizable in these manipulations. Why am I telling you all this? Because Puccini uses these techniques in his student works. Here is his Mass for Four Voices, which we now call the Messa di Gloria, which he wrote at age 20. This is the Kyrie, and I'll show you on the screen what's going on with counterpoint. First voice, second, third, fourth. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. First voice, second, third, and fourth. All right, so Puccini is putting to use these techniques that he's learned in school. Here's a better example. This is an actual fugue, Cum Sancto Spiritu, with the Holy Spirit, from this same Mass. And you'll hear the voices entering in this very academic-sounding fugue subject. First voice. Second voice. Third voice. Fourth voice. So composers of any stripe were expected to know how to do this. This is a technique that goes back, of course, to J.S. Bach. And these techniques of counterpoint were part and parcel of any decent composer's education. Counterpoint like this doesn't have a big role to play in opera. In fact, one of the reasons opera was invented was because of a reaction to counterpoint, where it was so hard to understand the words with all these different voices entering at different times. But sometimes we do find it. Puccini at this point gets a grant to attend the Milan Conservatory. Queen Margherita of Savoy, wife of King Umberto, was involved in this. And Puccini was helped by Niccolao Cerù, who was a cousin of his mother. He had helped out since the death of Puccini's father when Puccini was only 5. So at the Conservatory, he enters rather late in life, age 21, 1880. It wasn't unusual for young students to enter the Conservatory at age 13 or 14. In fact, when Verdi applied to the Conservatory some years earlier, he was rejected because he was 18 years old and they said he was too old. There was another problem, which was that he was considered a foreigner since he was from Parma, which at that point was a different country. But of course, at this point, Italy was united by the 1880s. Puccini's teacher at the Conservatory was Antonio Bazzini, and he writes to Puccini's mother, "The competition in Milan is enormous. He may be sure of a recommendation from me. In the meantime, he must make useful contacts, and I think this will not be difficult since he has a pleasant way with him and a likable personality." I would love to have gone to dinner with him. But above all, he must work diligently and keep to the rules of discipline. Another teacher of his was Amilcare Ponchielli, whom we know famously because he wrote The Dance of the Hours in his opera La Gioconda. what you're thinking. All right. Puccini's roommate at this time at the conservatory was Pietro Mascagni, who would become the composer of Cavalleria Rusticana, which really is the quintessential Verismo work, if there is one. Both Mascagni and Puccini were admirers of Wagner, and in fact, Puccini did go to Bayreuth when he was 30, 1889. This is the special theater that Wagner had built in Bavaria, but Wagner had died some years earlier, so they did not meet. At this point, we get Puccini's first published work, I believe, right here, when he was 24, called Storiella d'amore, a little story of love. And it tells the story of the love of Francesca da Rimini and her affair with Paolo, her husband's younger and cuter brother, I would point out. This story comes to us from Dante, from the Inferno, and he tells us that these two were killed by Francesca's husband, and the two lovers end up in hell, which seems rather unfair. I think the husband should have been there, but Dante was rather judgmental. I mean, who am I to criticize the great Dante? The poetry we're going to hear is by Antonio Ghislanzoni. These two fell in love while reading a book. That's how the story goes. You see, they've kind of lost their interest in the book somehow there. All right, so here is Puccini's first published work, Storiella d'amore. So we see at age 24 here, in his early 20s, he hasn't written an opera yet, but he's showing this incredible melodic gift, a really wonderful way of expressing emotion. And these are his additions here, the repeat of Noi leggevamo insieme. He's giving us an idea of what happens when this young woman's hair falls into his face. At this point, we get his graduation piece from the Conservatorio, his Capriccio Sinfonico, as it's called. He's 24 now, and he gets a review in La Perseveranza. In Puccini, we have a decisive and rare musical temperament, and one which is especially symphonic, which is ironic since his career is going to be entirely in opera. There is unity of style, personality, character. There are no uncertainties or gropings in the young author. The ideas are clear, strong, effective, and sustained with much truth. Here's a little bit of the Capriccio Sinfonico. This will sound familiar. So Puccini was not above borrowing from himself, recycling music. Most composers did this at some point. So in 1896, 13 years after this, he used this music for the beginning of La Bohème. And now we associate those opening notes, ba-dum-bum-bum, which occur often throughout the opera. We associate them with the hijinks of these clowning around young bohemian starving artists. But the idea for this had come some years earlier.
Questo mar rosso mi ammollisce a sidera. Come se addosso mi piovesse in stille. Per vendicare mia
So a student piece, a graduation requirement, gets recycled and becomes the beginning of his arguably most successful opera. Edward Sonsonio, who headed music publishing, no offense to Ricordi, in 1883 announced a competition for a one-act opera on an idyllic, serious, or comic subject. And Ponchielli, who was Puccini's teacher, encouraged him to apply, and he matched him up with the librettist, that is to say the poet who would write the words, the text, the script, whatever, a guy named Ferdinando Fontana. And we see the two young men there together, Fontana with the larger mustache. And the piece that they write is Le Villi, which we would call the Willies. A villa in Slavic myth is a female fairy-like spirit who lives in the wilderness and sometimes in the clouds. And there's a depiction of a Serbian painting of a villa there. You are familiar with this concept if you know the ballet Giselle, ou les Willies, or Giselle or the Willies, 1841 by Adolphe Adam. And in this story, a jilted bride and her companions are trying to make the hero dance to death. But in the end, if you know the ballet, the heroine relents, and the young man is not required to dance to death. Not so in the opera. Le Villi premieres in 1884. Puccini's now age 26, Teatro del Verme in Milan. And he told his mother he took 18 curtain calls, so that must be true. Here's a quick synopsis. Roberto leaves his village sweetheart Anna to collect an inheritance. By the time he returns penniless after wild carousals with sirens, Anna has died of a broken heart. The Villi, that is, ghosts of jilted brides, appear and force him to dance to death, mocking his pleas for forgiveness. We have this verismo idea of strong, dramatic emotion and violence coming out here. Here is a good example of Puccini's melodic gifts here, and particularly his, if you listen to the orchestra beginning this piece, his wonderful way of setting the stage, giving us an emotional background for what's about to happen. Roberto must leave to claim an inheritance. Worried that he might not return, she has good reason to worry, Anna puts a bouquet of forget-me-nots in his luggage. Let's listen to this wonderful evocation of the scene in the orchestra. If you know La Boheme, you'll realize that this is very evocative of the beginning of the third act of La Boheme, that wintry scene. It's very good about sort of setting that kind of atmospheric moment. Here's the beginning of the aria. A lovely piece, very Puccini-esque, but not very well sung there. Let's listen to the end of it, sung by Leontyne Price. Soaring lyricism, for sure, in Puccini's first opera, and the sentimentality that touches our hearts and annoys the intellectuals. Here is the tenor aria from this same show, Torna alle felici dì, My Thought Returns to Happy Days. So Roberto returns repentant and remorseful, too late, hoping that Anna is still alive. She is not. And he longs for the happiness of the past days, but the Villi, these ghosts of the jilted maidens, haunt him.
Fiori alla
This is sometimes called an opera ballet because there is a tremendous amount of dance in it. You see, this is Le Villi on the left, and that's the ballet Giselle on the right. But unlike Giselle, where the hero is redeemed at the end, our Roberto dies, danced to death, and let's watch the ending, very Verismo ending of the show.
Anna Pietà.
Very dramatic piece. The staging may be a little over the top, but it certainly has its dramatic effect. He gets a review from this in the Corriere della Sera. The virtues we encounter in Le Villi reveal in Puccini an imagination singularly inclined to melody. Got that right. In his music, there is a freshness of fantasy. There are phrases that touch the heart because they must have come from the heart. In short, we believe that in Puccini we may have the composer for whom Italy has been waiting. Verdi chimed in. He's 71 at this point. I've heard the musicians Puccini spoken very well spoken of. He follows modern trends, which is natural, but he keeps steadily to melody, which is neither ancient nor modern. At this point, Puccini signs with Ricordi Publishers, and Giulio Ricordi, the head of the firm, becomes the father he never really had, becomes a sort of a mentor to him throughout the rest of his career. In 1886, he begins a rather scandalous situation, living with Elvira Gimignani, née Bonturi, the wife of Narciso Gimignani. She already had 2 children by her husband, and she, at this point, had a child by Puccini, a son who was born in December of that year and christened Antonio. As you might expect under the social norms of the time, her daughter came to live with her, but her son stayed with his father. And Puccini would eventually marry Elvira 18 years later in 1904 after her husband finally died. Divorce, of course, was not an option at this point. Elvira, there are lots of stories. And Elvira was incredibly jealous about Puccini. She had great reason to be. We don't have time for those stories. You can ask about them in the Q&A if you like. The second opera comes in 1889. He's 30 now, and that's Edgar, premieres at La Scala in Milan. And here's our quick synopsis. The chaste Fidelia, we have significant names here, loves Edgar, but the temptress Tigrana, another significant name, has him under her spell. After quarreling with Fidelia's brother Frank, who is also captivated by Tigrana, Edgar flees with her, but eventually, tiring of his dissolute life with Tigrana, Edgar reconciles with Frank and becomes a soldier in his regiment. Denouncing himself in disguise at his own mock funeral, he finds only the bereaved Fidelia defends his memory. Tigrana yields to the temptation of jewels and agrees to defame the supposedly dead Edgar. Revealing that he is still alive, he claims Fidelia as his faithful true love. But the vengeful Tigrana stabs her. Soldiers lead Tigrana away as Edgar weeps over Fidelia's lifeless body. As I mentioned, Verismo has a lot of violence in it. We're going to watch some video excerpts. This is a commercial video with Jose Cura as Edgar, Amarili Nizza as Fidelia, and Julia Gertseva as Tigrana, Marco Bratonio as Frank. We're going to listen to a pezzo concertato, as the Italian would say, a concerted piece, or we often would just say concertato in the opera world, a large ensemble of soloists and chorus generally to be found at the second movement of a finale, to which it forms the lyrical climax. It was a constant feature of Italian opera throughout the 19th century, and there are lots of these concertati in Verdi. We're going to get a motive here very distinctive. Bum, bum, ba, da, da, dee, da, dee, da, dee. That is a motive we associate with Edgar himself. Bum, bum, ba, da, da, dee, da, dee, da, dee. No extra charge for my singing tonight. There are lots of these themes that we associate with ideas, props, emotions, people in Puccini. The most famous one, almost everyone on the street knows, even if they don't know where it comes from. In the aria Nessun Dorma in Turandot, we get da 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 dee da dee da dum. And that is not the theme of insomnia, although it comes in Nessun Dorma, which means none shall sleep. It's the theme of the secret name, the theme of the unknown name of the hero. In the first moment we hear that theme, da 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 dee da dee da dum, it's accompanied by the words, Il mio nome non sai. You don't know my name. So these themes are significant throughout Puccini. And this one, bum, bum, ba-da, da-dee, 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 starts this concertato. Here's our situation. The fiery Tigrana mocked worshippers singing in church. We get lots of church music there that Puccini was trained for in conservatory. And they angrily turned on her. Edgar intervened and tried to take her away, but his rival Frank stopped them. Before the two men could fight, Frank's father has called for calm, and all react collectively in this concertato. There's Tigrana in red, of course. There's Edgar. Over here is Fidelia in white, her brother Frank, who loves Fidelia, or loves Tigrana, I should say. And in the middle, the father, who's tried to calm things down. Here is this concertato. Listen to that theme at the beginning. What's significant about these concertati is that opera is the only medium where they would work. If you had everybody talking at once with expressing different emotions in a film, in a play, on TV, in a podcast, whatever, it would become an incomprehensible jumble, but in opera it works because the music makes it work. Here's a little bit of the orchestral introduction to the second act. Edgar's now grown tired of his coarse revels with Tigrana and her followers, and his thoughts turn to the chaste Fidelia. But we get that theme that we heard before. Bum, bum, ba, da, da, dee, da, dee, da, dee. fully in charge of the orchestral palette. He's really mastered orchestration at this point. What would opera be without drinking songs? Here's a little bit of Tigrana's. And we'll now go to the end of the coffin scene. We're wrapping things up here. Tigrana yields to the temptation of Jules and agrees to defame the supposedly dead Oscar, who then reveals his disguise as a monk. Turns out that coffin is empty. Here is the coffin scene. Not sure why that's happening. Let's try this again. That's weird. I don't know what is causing that effect. Let me try to get into the slide again and see if that makes a difference. Maybe not. No. All right, well, that's an odd thing that I tested this out this morning. It didn't have it. Anyway, let's go to the very end, and you'll see that Tigrana gets her comeuppance. That's a disappointment. I don't know where that slide got corrupted somehow. Edgar was not a success. Puccini tinkered with it a lot. There are 4 different versions. Later, looking back on the failure of this opera, he took a copy of the vocal score and he added extra letters to the title. He wrote in, "E Dio ti guarda da questa opera." And God preserve you from this opera. But his next opera, 1893, at age 36, Manuel Lescaut, was a huge success, brought him fame and fortune. At this point, his youth is definitely over. So is this talk. Thanks for listening.
All right. So those of you familiar with Humanities West, we always have a Q&A at the end. So there's cards. You can fill them out. Lynn will pick them up if you have any questions, and we will take care of that. But first, we're going to do Gabriele Dato. And first, I would like to introduce Alberta Lai, Italian Cultural Institute Director, who, how long ago did you come? 6 months ago or so you came?
1 year ago.
1 year ago. Oh, my. Time has been moving fast. Okay. Welcome to Humanities West.
Buonasera. Thank you, George. Thank you for organizing tonight's event as a tribute to Giacomo Puccini on the occasion of the centennial of the composer's death. And I'm very happy to introduce the second speaker, Italian and American musicologist Gabriele Dotto. Born in Milan, Gabriele Dotto studied music composition, history, and analysis in the US and in Italy, and taught at the University of Cincinnati and the Conservatory of Milan. Since 1979, he has been concentrating on a career in publishing, first as an editor and later editor-in-chief at Casa Ricordi of Milan, the most important classical music and opera publisher in Italy. Then, from 1986 onwards, at the University of Chicago Press, where he became the first managing editor of the works of Giuseppe Verdi Critical Edition. Dotos has, among other things, published scholarly essays on 19th and 20th century music and the history of music, publishing critical editions of operas by various Italian composers, and served at the administration as the administrative director of the Istituto Nazionale di Studi Verdiani in Parma. From 2007 to 2023, he was the director of the Michigan State University Press. He's the general editor of critical edition of the operas of Giacomo Puccini and sits in many prestigious international scientific committees related to Puccini and other Italian composers. This year, Gabriele has curated the exhibition Opera Meets New Media, Puccini, Ricordi, and the Rise of the Modern Entertainment Industry, presented by Bertelsmann and realized by the contribution of Comitato Promotore delle Celebrazioni Pucciniane to mark the 100th anniversary of Giacomo Puccini's death. The exhibition that premiered in Berlin is currently on display at Museo Teatrale alla Scala in Milan. And the topic of Dotos' lecture tonight is strictly or directly related to the theme of such an exhibition. I would like to thank Gabriele Dotto for accepting our invitation to San Francisco and for traveling all the way from France to the West Coast. Thank you very much and enjoy his lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me take a moment to make it easier to follow my lecture. I'm going to fake a Midwestern accent. So when I first got to Chicago, the biggest disappointment was that I didn't have an Italian accent. I could fake one. I don't know quite where to hang this, so if I just tuck it in my pants, can you still hear me?
Yes.
All right. You'll cut that out of the YouTube clip. All right. I want to thank you for this invitation. It's such a joy to be back in San Francisco. I came here several times in the 1990s and the early 2000s for various musicological meetings, and always made sure I had enough time to get to know the city really well. It's just wonderful. And thank you, Dr. Lai. Thank you so much for this invitation. It was a joy to come here. And as she mentioned, the idea for this actually, for part of the theme that I'll talk about tonight, actually started 5 years ago. We had done a large exhibit. Some of you might have gone to see it at the Morgan Library in New York about the last two operas, Verdi, Boito, that had been in many ways spurned on to do these last masterpieces by Giulio Ricordi. And at that time, it was a great success. And the head of the Bertelsmann marketing team asked, so what do we do next? And I said, how about Puccini in the 20th century? No one had any idea what I was talking about, which is fun, because then in designing the exhibit itself, it was great to see it all come together in some ways with all kinds of challenges. And I said, this is exactly how you stage an opera, so don't worry. At the end, it'll go on stage just fine. So what the theme is going to be about has to do with the impact that was really striking and stunning to the people of those times, which is, of course, why can't I see it on the screen here? Because it is. Right. So you have to imagine now, put yourself in the mindset, it's 1900, it's 1901. So in the very early 20th century, new technology created this upheaval of the traditional models of performances and earnings. which were sales of printed music, traditional editorial way of making money, sales of musical instruments, which are directly related to amateur performance of this music, and live performances, box office revenues. And for a publisher like Ricordi, much more than many other European publishers, this was an extremely important revenue stream. Sorry to get so businesslike, but the fact is staged opera earned so-called grand rights, and that's where Ricordi's enormous money came from. There's also the fact that Puccini comes at a time when he is able to take advantage, not through any doing of his own, but the fact that Ricordi was among the principal players of fighting for the recognition of music performing rights in the late 19th century. Imagine, Rossini, his entire career, never earned a royalty. It was all work for hire. Singers were paid as much as 5 times what the composer was paid to write the opera. In fact, as an aside, Rossini, in his retirement, married a retired singer. By the time you get to Verdi, his career straddles a time when music performance was not being remunerated for the composer very well. And in fact, Verdi lived long enough to see many of his earlier works fall into public domain because of the way these protections worked. So live performance and box office revenue was the key to how these earnings were made by a publisher like Ricordi, which was a publisher above all of opera. Ricordi also benefited from the fact that, as William Weaver defined it, from the about the Barber of Seville, so 1816, Rossini's masterpiece, comic masterpiece, to Turandot, the last opera of, Puccini, is what is defined as the golden century, with a bit of latitude. This would be like Rubato because it's actually 110 years. But the idea is this is a moment when Italian opera was the most performed, most important staged throughout Europe, staged kind of spectacle that from St. Petersburg all the way to Barcelona, everyone enjoyed, and then later into the Americas as well. One of the fascinating aspects of the rapid advances in the popularity and the commercial success of new media in the early 20th century, most specifically recordings and cinema, is the way in which these threatened to disrupt traditional business models of music publishing and live musical performance. Models that, as I mentioned, had been in place for well over a century. And connected to that, how did they affect both a composer's income and the respect for intellectual property? Now, one thing I want to say right away, because some journalists had misinterpreted what we were doing with this exhibit. By no means are we saying that it was thanks to new media that Puccini became as popular as he did. By no means, nor that it created Puccini. In fact, the interest of the lies in the fact of how does this model of performance change the approach? Puccini himself never wrote music for cinema. Many of his contemporaries did, but he did not. So by the dawn of the 20th century, in a year following the premiere of Tosca, Giacomo Puccini had inherited from Giuseppe Verdi the mantle of the most renowned living composer of Italian opera. Indeed, the legendary Verdi passed away the very first month of the 20th century, a coincidence that seems like a dramatic device from an opera plot. As a further remarkable coincidence, and one that would strain credulity, really, if it not a historical fact, Verdi's final operatic masterpiece, Falstaff, and Puccini's first true success, Manon Lescaut, premiered just 8 days apart from one another. Imagine how happy Ricordi was about that. So Manon premieres February the 1st in Turin, 1893, Falstaff, February the 9th in Milan. It's as though history itself were metaphorically emphasizing this passing of the crown from one king of opera to the next. And the turn of the century concept is important to what I'm also pointing out when we consider Puccini's career. Now, rarely in music history has an artist so successfully straddled 2 distinct different eras. In Puccini's case, from the gay 90s to the tumultuous teens of the roaring 20s, from the style of Art Nouveau to the threshold of Art Deco, from the denouement of the Belle Epoque with its horse-drawn carriages to the age of flight and of mass-market automobiles. And of course, from the time when there were only live, in-person performances, to the proliferation of technologies, records, cinema, and later on, as we'll see, radio transmissions, that would deeply impact the tradition-bound worlds of art, music, and theater. It's interesting to note that Puccini's opera production is evenly divided over this century break. So, assuming he writes 10 operas, because I'm going to assume that the Trittico was one, because it was never meant to be separated from the three pieces. His first 5 operas are all in the 19th century. His next 5 operas are all in the 20th century. And once his career was solidly established, his music would flourish astride these vastly different eras with unabated success, even surviving the radical upheavals of the musical avant-garde and early 20th century. We heard earlier, as Kip had mentioned, some of the opinions of Puccini that actually had continued through the 1930s into the 1960s. It's interesting to note, on a personal level, when in 1988 I was part of a panel. Hope we can still hear that. I was part of a panel at the American Musicological Society in 1988. It was the first time that the American Musicological Society had ever hosted papers on Puccini. Think of how remarkable that is. It took until 1988 for him to be accepted seriously, but his contemporaries, that wasn't necessarily the case. He was a keen student of new musical transformations. He eagerly kept abreast of new musical developments, and although Puccini himself felt distant from these new musical languages in his own artistic conception, this new avant-garde, he always kept a very open mind. His professional respect was also reciprocated. This is important to bear in mind. Stravinsky, Ravel, and Schoenberg, who considered Puccini to be superior to Verdi, all expressed their admiration for his music. In April of 1924, just a few months before he died, Palazzo Pitti in Florence hosted a festival of the International Society of Contemporary Music, aimed at presenting new musical trends to Italian audiences. The highlight of the performance was the Florentine premiere of Arnold Schoenberg's Pierrot Lunaire, an atonal melodrama for soprano and chamber orchestra, composed in 1912, and it was becoming the Austrian composer's most celebrated and most performed work. Schoenberg himself conducted that performance. To his delight, attending in the audience was, with his musical score in hand of Pierrot Lunaire, to follow the performance closely, was Italy's preeminent opera composer, Giacomo Puccini. Schoenberg considered Puccini one of the innovators of 20th century harmonic language and made reference to his works in his 1911 book, A Theory of Harmony. So overall, Puccini kept true to his ideals of music and theater, and he was rewarded handsomely, economically as well, not just in popularity, for this consistency. However, this is not to say that his musical language did not evolve. Over the course of his career, Puccini's later works, we find moments of surprising harmonic modernity, masterfully complex orchestration. Yet, even as the harmonic language of the 20th century operas grew more sophisticated, Puccini did not stray far from the chromatic complexities of extreme late Romanticism. This, coupled with his unequaled mastery, as we have seen, of vocal expression and unforgettable melodies, was a fundamental factor in his unparalleled success. As the historian Julian Budden once observed, no composer communicates more directly with an audience than Puccini. There's also this remarkable synergy that Puccini had with his publisher. On the left, there's Puccini with Giulio. The occasion is in 1910, they're opening the new production offices of Casa Ricordi on the west side of Milan. And on the right is Giulio's son, Tito II. They're on a boat on an ocean liner on their way to New York to see the first of the premiere of the Fanciullo del West. As far as Puccini's career is concerned, so let's take a step back and look at the beginnings, and at a synergy between art and commerce that would enormously improve Puccini's fortunes. So what I refer to is the 40-year partnership between Puccini and Casa Ricordi, a partnership that began actually as a felicitous accident, as we heard it earlier. In 1883, the young Puccini entered a one-act opera to a contest held by a rival Milanese music publisher, Sonzogno. Puccini did not win, but the head of the publisher of Casa Ricordi, Giulio Ricordi, whose gift for discovering talent was legendary, was advised by members of the competition jury that Puccini had enormous potential. The rest is history. Ricordi would publish that first opera by Puccini, Le Ville, and all his other operas except one. By the way, in the second Sonzogno competition, held 5 years later, the winner was Pietro Mascagni for the opera Cavalleria Rusticana, which is partly why Mascagni ended up being largely a composer in the Sonzogno stable of artists. So while Ricordi was fortunate to find the heir to Giuseppe Verdi, Puccini benefited enormously from the backing of a publisher that had become a global powerhouse. This is a film from 1926 showing the new production facilities of Casa Ricordi just outside of Milan. I love the Ricordi truck there. And lost my place. And here, also that production facility, these were extremely modern printing facilities they had at that time. They could turn out enormous quantities of music. They would even supply music for third parties. These are the production facilities newly constructed in 1910 outside of Milan. So as I mentioned at the beginning, by the turn of the 20th century, Puccini had become the most celebrated active composer of Italian opera, and Casa Ricordi, which was already an imposing business, was expanding its state-of-the-art production facilities. The company's administrators also had a very modern mindset, as well as the resources for skillful promotion, and this is important. Throughout Puccini's lifetime, the Ricordi firm hugely expanded its international presence. Ricordi opened offices in cities including London, Paris, New York, Buenos Aires. This is from that same film from the Istituto Luce. These are just the network in Europe alone. Vienna, Leipzig, and Berlin, and developed agreements with foreign publishers. In the Americas, New York, Mexico, Sao Paulo, and Buenos Aires. South America especially having an enormous presence of Italian immigrants, very well-to-do Italian immigrants that, of course, one of the first things they did was make sure to build opera theaters. These policies helped Ricordi control the circulation of its music and also to enforce international copyright laws, while making its headquarters in Milan central to a globalized musical world. Ricordi also published a series of influential music journals, beginning with the Gazzetta Musicale di Milano, that reported on musical activity across Europe and the Americas, shaping the views of the Italian public on major musical developments at the time. As a testament to the Ricordi Publishing Company's business acumen, in 1911, just after The Fanciulla del West had premiered at the Metropolitan Opera, the New York Times ran a gushing two-page article stating that the Ricordis of Milan have been factors in operatic history for 100 years. The synergy of Puccini's talent and Ricordi's resources was a powerful combination for success. And by the way, this entire article is available online without being a subscriber to the New York Times. It is a fascinating read because it talks about how Ricordi, it mentions other composers who had had important premieres at the Metropolitan and said, where is their publisher? Where are their agents? Who has come by? In this case, Tito Ricordi came over, and immediately after the first night of the performance of the Fanciulla del West, he was off to Boston for the premiere of the Fanciulla there, and then off to Chicago, and the amount of promotion that was done was just amazing. But in the early 20th century, here comes a disruptor, sound recordings, which go from a niche novelty to a major business competition. Now, by 1899, records had, of course, been available for 2 decades, but sales increased exponentially in the 20th century. As production costs dropped, more affordable recordings coincided with an increased interest in cultural betterment. Again, it was a happy accident. In both Europe and abroad, people were aspiring to improve their culture. Opera repertory benefited since recordings from the acoustic era, which goes up to 1925, the entire life of Puccini, these recordings reproduced a singing voice to particular advantage, and especially, as it turns out, the voice of a tenor. Just acoustically, it worked better on these early shellac recordings. And in the United States alone, the commercial value of the recording industry quadrupled from 1899 to 1904. The growing interest in opera in the U.S., reaching a previously untapped audience, and that's an important point, was seen as a direct consequence of recorded sound. Here's some wonderful ads from the time, catalogs dedicated to some of the most famous tenors. And while all this, that's a Ricordi poster, by the way, that absolutely gorgeous Fonotipia Dischi Ricordi. And of course, sales of the gramophone exploded. And while all this raised the visibility and the value of Ricordi's opera catalog, it challenged the music publisher's traditional business models. Whereas sheet music and attendance in theaters might reach thousands, opera recordings were selling in the tens, even the hundreds of thousands. In 1905, a recording of Caruso singing Vesti la giubba from Pagliacci, not a recorded publication, unfortunately, became the first record ever to sell 1 million copies. This is not it. I'm having you hear something from Tosca. Let me make one point before we go any further, and that is, when listening to recordings like this, apart the fact that, of course, they would not have heard the noise back then, but every era has a technology in which the contemporaries find it to be simply astonishing. We can't go with our 2024 ears and think that this was a dreadful thing to listen to. There's a wonderful letter in the Ricordi archive where Giulio Ricordi says a band had brought him a record of the band playing. He played it in his office, and numerous employees came in wanting to hear where was the band. And there were famous advertisements from the early part of the 20th century where they would put a recording and a live singer behind a curtain in the theater and ask the public if they could distinguish who was singing when. And at the time, the public could not. So it's a bit like, you may recall what videos looked like in the 1990s, and if we compare them to high definition now, we would think, how did we like that? Well, at the time, when you're a contemporary, you're amazed by the technology. So this was clearly something to be seen as competition. In 1907, while Puccini was in New York to supervise performances of 4 of his operas, he wrote this extensive letter, which was translated into English. We don't have the original Italian. It was published in the New York Herald, which touched upon these critical issues. And now I'm coming back to the issue of copyright. And I quote, I am inclined to be rather proud of the fact that my country is among the first in the world to extend to composers the right of controlling the reproduction of their works by means of any and all modern mechanical musical instruments, including the phonograph. Of course, when our Italian copyright laws were promulgated, no such means of reproducing sound waves was dreamed of. But Italian courts have held that phonographs are within the copyright law on the broad principle that the originator, in other words, the composer, is entitled to use and control of his mental creations, regardless of the means whereby they are reproduced for the benefit of the public. While I am heartily glad to note that eminent interpreters of my music, including fellow countrymen like Messrs. Caruso and Scotti, are not only paid princely honorariums for rendering solos from my operas on phonographs, but are also allowed liberal royalties on the sale of those records, it seems strangely inconsistent that the composer of those very themes should not be granted even slight pecuniary recognition. I'm sure the American people, who are firm believers in the principle of justice, equity, and square dealing, will join hands with Italy in the suppression of this form of musical piracy." End quote. In 1898, Ricordi and other publisher filed a lawsuit against the Gramophone Society, claiming that they recorded and distributed copyright-protected musical works without permission. The Gramophone Society, however, maintained that the recordings did not constitute a violation of copyright, since they were a new form of music dissemination. The case was initially decided in favor of the publishers, but in 1902, the Italian court overturned the sentences, ruling that Ricordi's on disc was not an infringement of copyright, which was established in Italy in 1882, well before the advent of commercially available recordings, to protect written and not acoustically reproduced music. The ruling of the court created an important precedent that would have important legal repercussions elsewhere in Europe as well, highlighting the lack of precise legislation that addressed this new reality of mechanical sound reproduction. The ongoing controversy over copyright also caused a rift between Giulio Ricordi and his son Tito II, leaving Ricordi deeply troubled by the new invention and reluctant to invest in the production of records themselves. As one historian has observed, quote, "In those years, Giulio considered the innovations of modernism to be a problem rather than an opportunity. His passions lay elsewhere. For him, the company's role had much more to do with ensuring the developmental continuity of Italy's musical heritage rather than with new technologies. Unlike his son Tito, the connection between these two dimensions was beyond him." Now, over time, Tito Ricordi, who was enthralled by these new techniques because he had studied engineering. He was also a musician, but rather than studying law, he studied engineering. So, of course, he was fascinated by these new technologies. He came around with his father, Giulio. He thought these new recorded sound really was something to embrace, but then he started to become wary of its potential impact on the publisher's more traditional revenue. As an example, by the time 1910 that the New York premiere of La Fanciulla del West occurred, Tito was reported by an contemporary American magazine as having refused to permit American talking machine companies to mechanically reproduce any of the music in The Girl of the Golden West. Selections from Tosca, Bohème, and Madame Butterfly have a large sale in talking machine records. Some of the interest taken in The Girl by the public is shown by the fact that out of 1,000 scores that Ricordi sent to this country, not one was unsold by the end of the first week. Now, this has been taken and it has been assumed by many modern biographers to mean that they were hypothesizing that Ricordi was worried that phonograph records might curtail the sales of its vocal scores. I think instead that it's far more likely that what happened was Tito's concern over the unresolved issue at that time in the United States, as opposed to Europe, of adequate copyright protection and compensation to the rights owner, that is, the composer and publisher. He was afraid that the sale of mechanical recordings produced by third parties in a country that did not recognize their protection would mean a complete loss of royalties at that end. So in the end, Casa Ricordi's indirect participation in the business of producing records had gradually been set aside. They wanted to get into the phonotypia, that one that I showed you earlier. They were going to become a participant. There you go. In that company there, Phonotypia, out of Milano. They decided in the end not to invest, but decided to increase their efforts to ensure that intellectual property rights and performance rights revenues would be protected when dealing with new technologies. One of the early solutions that they adopted is interesting. You'll remember the record I showed you in the beginning, this one here. One of the solutions they adopted was to sell a fixed number of labels. So a recording company would buy 100, 1,000, 5,000 of these labels that you see here. Says the record is by Pathé, but it's authorized by G. Ricordi. Without that label, it was considered to be an unauthorized sale. And many of you who have purchased books in Italy when you've traveled, you may have noticed this still survives in the CI stamp that you see inside books that shows that that is an authorized reproduction of a book. This still survives. It was an early solution that Ricordi had decided to use for records. The question became more urgent as recording costs became even more affordable, allowing commercialization not just of records, of short excerpts, but of entire operas. As early as 1903, a British record company, His Master's Voice, issued the first record of an entire opera, Verdi's Ernani, on 40 single-sided discs. Thus, here indeed was the direct competition to the established model of how music was consumed via professional performances. That is, by spending an evening in the theater. Instead, with a full record set, you could listen to the entire opera at home. Yet what was first seen as a disruptive challenge to the publisher's role in the chain of music dissemination would soon prove to be a promotional boon for the popularity of opera programming worldwide. As you can see here, you could even buy individual discs. By the way, those things were by no means still inexpensive. I did a calculation here somewhere. The 585 lira of this record is from 1929, this set. Today it would be $673. So it still was, it's like buying computers in the early years. It still was an expensive hobby, but for the middle class, an aspirational hobby, certainly. I was here somewhere. The greatest challenge was in the reproduction. On records, consumers could hear the greatest performers of the day in the comfort of their own home. Ultimately, Ricordi set aside ideas of participation, as I mentioned before, instead finding an effective means of compensation. Which takes us to the next issue. Movies. It is a modern-day misconception that silent movies were actually silent. Not at all. The use of musical accompaniment, speech, and even sound effects during film projections was fairly standard during the silent era. Early films could be accompanied musically in a variety of ways, depending on the venue, and might feature anything from a solo piano to a chamber ensemble, to a large orchestra, or even to sound recordings. We have sound recordings of short excerpts done back in the cylinder era with actors miming the singers, some of them even dressed up to look like actual singers. You may have seen on YouTube this clip of the sextet from Lucia di Lammermoor, where they used the recording and they actually hired an actor that looked like Caruso because they couldn't afford Caruso. What you'll see here, this is from 1906. This is in the Arena di Milano. Part of the celebrations of this exhibition that was going on that year, there was the worldwide exhibition, they also had a cinematograph, and you'll notice there's an entire orchestra here accompanying the films in 1906. Numerous film adaptations of operas were produced during the silent era. While cinema brought a certain novelty, opera offered prestigious and marketable subject matter and lent the new medium artistic credibility. Opera films would have been accompanied with music from the operas that they portrayed, though typically on an improvisational or an informal basis. Given their popularity, Puccini's operas proved particularly alluring to film companies. Tosca, for example, was adapted to the silent screen at least 8 different times. Cinema first appeared in Italy in March 1896, roughly 1 month after the premiere of La Bohème. The first film screenings in Milan were at the Teatro Milanese, which was just a few minutes' walk from La Scala and from the main offices of Puccini's publisher, Casa Ricordi. You can understand why they were worried. The watershed moment, when various changes in both production and reception increased cinema's potential relevance to the Italian opera industry, comes in 1905, really very early, just a year after Madame Butterfly. Film began to move away from its earlier associations with exhibitionism to emphasize narrative-based content and genres such as adventure, drama, history, biography. In short, by embracing narrative, film began to resemble established theatrical genres, including opera, more closely. Puccini's publisher was not alone in recognizing cinema's potential impact. As early as 1896, the Italian press had predicted that cinema would become, quote, so universal that it will do away with all other forms of entertainment. But after 1905, speculation grew, and the press began to compare cinema more frequently to theater, literature, and even opera. At the same time, cinema was becoming more accessible, with projections appearing in an ever-expanding array of public venues. In 1905, the number of new movie theaters increased dramatically, with more theaters opening in that 1 year than in all previous years combined. In 1907, the Corriere della Sera noted that cinemas were, quote, growing exponentially, spreading from the central neighborhoods of the city into the periphery. They are invading old cafes, old trattorie, even old theaters, which have been made, therefore, obsolete. It seems that the future belongs only to them. In 1906, this is very early times, the issue became an object of concern to the administrators of Casa Ricordi. A lawyer on the board reported that he had received word from Palermo of a new form of mechanical music production, using pieces from Verdi's Traviata to accompany a film. He saw this as, quote, a grave threat of competition through the unauthorized applications of continuous, newly devised technologies. He warned that this was an early attempt at what will, in the future, surely develop into more extensive spectacles, accompanied by entire operas. He concluded that this could significantly damage the company's properties since, in small towns, he even named what they were, Monza, Lodi, so forth, right? They could see a performance of La Traviata just as one might see at La Scala. And we can understand how the audiences of those tiny theaters would fill those halls in order to hear, more or less faithfully reproduced, the voices of great artists they would never have dreamed of being able to hear in their own provincial venues. They would thus stop producing expensive shows, with their consequently expensive tickets, and choose instead to attend the local cinema, spending just 20 or 30 cents. In 1914, that is, more than a dozen years before the advent of the talkies, in other words, synchronized sound on film, a director of Casa Ricordi wrote, at this point, the film industry has achieved such a degree of perfection in blending action and music with marvelous synchrony that today some reproductions of operas can be considered as true and complete artistic spectacles. During the silent era, roughly 30 different films were released, either in Europe or the United States, that had potential connections to Puccini's operas. I say potential, I'll mention why in a moment. Tosca and La Bohème attracted the most interest, with no less than 15 different silent films tied to one of these two works. Also adapted for the silent screen were Madame Butterfly, Manon Lescaut, La Fanciulla del West, La Rondine, and Gianni Schicchi. Here's a small bit from Madame Butterfly, 1915. Now, we can't be certain whether, in order to get around the need to have a contractual agreement with Casa Ricordi, if the film producers would claim that they were basing their film on Belasco's play. In fact, in a couple of occasions, Belasco did give permission to do such things as the Girl of the Golden West, or whether they were basing it on Puccini's opera. The fact is, in many cases, it seems blatant that they were, of course, using the popularity of the Puccini opera, because you can tell by the way the staging is done and how the set design is done. Here, for instance, is Tosca. By the way, with Francesca Berrettini, a huge star in those days. This is from 1918. This is actually filmed at Castel Sant'Angelo, and the way that the costumes are done, her costumes as well, and the way it's laid out, almost exactly mimic the first costumes done at the premiere of Tosca. So even though the film company might argue that they were basing it on Sardou, and the Sardou heirs had given them permission, it's more than likely that it was based on the opera itself. Now, these would have been accompanied by music. We don't know what music, because the scores for these have not survived. But since permission would not have been granted, they would have found a way to improvise around the music of Tosca, just enough so it wasn't quite the actual quotes, or maybe something that sounded Puccini-esque. And we know how that phenomenon works. Now, although in several instances Puccini objected to the use of his music as a film accompaniment, his correspondence with Ricordi indicates that he was not opposed to the matter in every case. Instead, his objections always related to his music being used without his express permission, and of course without the payment of royalties. Ricordi received regular requests to adapt operas for the screen throughout the silent era. Puccini's operas garnered particular interest. Ultimately, the publisher received so many requests that they soon would only respond to serious offers with complete proposals rather than answering every query. And only when a particularly promising proposal arose would Ricordi approach Puccini about the project. But when such repeated requests became too burdensome, the publisher eventually requested the composer's carte blanche for making arrangements. As such, arranging contracts for film adaptations would follow similar procedures as arranging contracts with opera houses for the performances of the operas themselves. And this is interesting. In Puccini's last contract, his contract for Turandot, they even included a clause that would grant to Ricordi permission to work with film companies to adapt that opera to the screen. So when companies expressed an interest in adapting one of Puccini's operas to the screen, one of Ricordi's requirements was that any film adaptation for an opera had to be accompanied by music from that opera, and the film could not be made without that music, or the accompaniment could not be compiled from various sources interspersed with newly composed material. Moreover, Ricordi required that films adapting operas must be accompanied by a specially arranged score of original music, which they saw as inseparable from the drama and crucial to the success of the opera on the screen. In other words, the accompaniment could neither be improvised nor drawn from previously published scores. Despite this stipulation, however, Puccini's music was so popular that it was eventually continually used to accompany a wide range of films, both those related to his operas and mainstream films as well, and there was no point trying to chase down these abuses. Which brings us to a new form of piracy. Now, piracy has always existed with music. From the times when music performances left the courts or private theaters and became a commercial enterprise, piracy had existed as ways to avoid paying fees for music in performance, or through the sales of illicit copies of sheet music. The damage for the composer was not only monetary, but reputational. Now what happens is pop music plagiarism. Around this time, pop music becomes a big commercial matter. Think of Tin Pan Alley. In 1892, I believe it is, I hope I got that right, the first piece of pop music, sheet music, sold 2 million copies. was after the ball is over. Again, these are numbers that would have been astonishing to any publisher of classical music. Pop music, plagiarism took matters to a new level. In February of 1922, Puccini was surprised to learn that some of his most famous arias had been arranged for sale to the general public as pieces of popular dance music. Such arrangements were already circulating on the sly in the repertory of various American jazz club orchestras, but now one of them appeared for sale in the New York shop window of Casa Ricordi, an affiliate of that very same Milanese publisher with whom the composer had collaborated for almost 40 years. Puccini's ensuing legal dispute, which moved the matter from the showroom to the courtroom, ended with a verdict that awarded him both financial and moral damages. And while this episode may seem to be a relatively unimportant biographical detail, the litigation illustrates an important aspect for this period of upheaval in the international music industry. The music in question was produced 2 years earlier by a music publisher based in Detroit, a foxtrot. We saw the cover earlier, called Avalon, released in a recording in 1920 by its original performer and accredited co-composer, Al Jolson, the very same Al Jolson of the Jazz Singer. Indeed, in 1921, Avalon reached second place on the American sales charts for 9 weeks. However, the melodic profile of the chorus of Avalon begins with a line that strongly resembles that of O dolci baci o languide carezze from E lucevano le stelle di Tosca. You'll first hear Al Jolson sing.
I found my love in Avalon, beside the bed.
And here's Caruso singing the same phrase from Tosca. The plagiarism is so direct that the court could not help but award Ricordi the cause. Puccini intended to have the Ricordi affiliate of New York sue the Detroit publisher, who preferred to settle out of court with a payment of $14,000 and all future royalties from the song, after which they sent a letter of apology to Puccini for having unwittingly misappropriated his music. Puccini was pleased with the court's decision, and with the earnings, he bought himself a fancy new speedboat, which he christened, you can barely see it, Liu, because at the time he was composing Turandot, and Liu was the character that he invented. It doesn't exist in the original. And there's actually a film of him tooling about on Lago di Massachucoli in that boat. Quite nice indeed. By the way, $14,000 in 1922 is more than $250,000 today. So they made out all right. Puccini later discovered that yet another foxtrot, this time using two themes lifted directly from Madama Butterfly, the humming chorus, the Un bel dì vedremo, had meantime been published as Cho-Cho-San, that other piece of sheet music we saw earlier, by the same Ricordi in New York, which had mistakenly thought it was free to do so without the composer's consent. Now, just to summarize this point, the publication of piano transcriptions and fantasies were common. Those always, however, remained in the realm of art music. Think of the transcriptions by Franz Liszt of pieces by Donizetti. The problem now was one about moral rights, was one about something that the composer, having used this in popular genres without the composer's knowledge, was looked upon as a possible abasement of the repertory. The next step for Puccini, for Ricordi protecting its value, was that of its branding of Puccini's operas. And here it really was very much at the forefront of this kind of technique, even before these new technologies occurred. It was central, Ricordi was central to the birth of an Italian cultural industry in the early 20th century. Giulio Ricordi in the 1870s acquired world-class color printing equipment and split his business into two. One half was devoted to music printing, the other half to the visual arts. This other division was called the Officine Grafiche Ricordi, and Giulio hired top-flight graphic artists to lead its creative staff. Some of these artists also collaborated as set and stage designers for operas, so very familiar with their subject matter. The premiere of a new opera by Puccini involved coordinated efforts from both sides of the firm. In each case, one of Officina's house artists would give the new opera its distinctive look, determine its color scheme, costumes, and even some of the set designs. Here, for instance, you'll see a running theme of the Bohème characters that had been designed by Adolf Hohenstein, used in sheet music covers, and of course, and this famous poster as well. So a unified theme, which is interesting because it creates a through line that is deployed internationally in its publications. While each opera was branded differently, Puccini's name and portrait provided this unification of advertising schemes, which is the kind of approach that we would become familiar with later in the 20th century, in the 1930s and 1940s, used mostly by the automobile industry and by such things as home appliances. But here was Ricordi pioneering it at the end of the 19th century. Posters for Edgar, Bohème, Tosca, Madame Butterfly, and Turandot were designed in Stile Liberty by this team. And in some cases, the poster art itself became world-famous examples in the history of design. Ricordi's marketing campaigns for Puccini's operas quickly expanded beyond posters into things like postcards, perfume cards, pocket calendars, and other collectibles for luxury objects. Here you see a set of dishes that have been licensed on themes from the Bohème, ceramic plates by Richard Ginori, and Ricordi strengthened its composer's ties to the idea of the upper middle-class markets by publishing accounts of his own luxury pursuits, including fast cars, hunting, and yachting. I brought some samples of delightful objects that were either licensed or created by Casa Ricordi at that time. In this case, we have a butterfly-themed cigar box and a silk typewriter ribbon based on butterfly, calendars and perfume samples. There we see an apotheosis of Puccini himself. And then, of course, postcards that became sought-after collectibles. And this was a very lucrative side business for Casa Ricordi in the early part of the 20th century. Huge part of its income came from selling postcards. Here's a set of postcards, of course, designed in that way. Here's a box set of 12 cartoline by Metlikovitz this time for Tosca. And here are fake postage stamps, not real postage stamps, that you could affix to your letters to send off based on Tosca and whatever. This one I find somewhat macabre, considering the way he died. These are cigarette papers dedicated to the Bohème by Puccini. And of course, with enormous fame comes universal name recognition, as we know today. And so businesses rush in to seek testimonials. Puccini wrote his greatest operas with a Parker pen. Now, we don't know for certain whether Puccini himself authorized, much less received payments for this one. And as an aside, I might point out, I own a Parker pen, and I can attest to the fact that simply using that pen in and of itself is not sufficient to guarantee that you will write a masterpiece. Puccini, of course, also took advantage of the new and easier means of travel. We don't know if he ever flew in an airplane, although airplane travel started to become common even in commercial flights by the mid-1920s. But certainly he became very much a seafaring man, and he made regular trips to London, Paris, Berlin, and Vienna, where he could also hear the latest foreign musical works, like Strauss's operas or Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. He was there in 1913. Visits to Madrid, Brussels, Hamburg, Budapest, and Bayreuth similarly enhanced his celebrity. And though Puccini never conducted his own works, between 1905 and 1910, here he is leaving Geneva on a trip to Buenos Aires in 1905. Here he is being a tourist on the Brooklyn Bridge. He's there in 1910 for the premiere of following the rehearsals for the Fanchula of the West. And for some time, we wondered, why is he posed just in that one spot? And we then discovered, by taking a closer analysis, If you look here on the left, that's the Singer Building. So that was a standard place where tourists would go to be photographed next to what was, at the time, the tallest skyscraper in the world. So there's Puccini. Of course, we also have pictures of him at the gardens and zoos, etc. These visits underline the importance of the Americas as new centers for Italian operatic culture, while festivals of Puccini's works, world premieres abroad, Fanciulla, Il Trittico, and lavish celebrations all helped to establish Puccini's works on a global international stage. There was also the idea of creating a fan base, a very modern concept, not something you would imagine happening with Verdi just a few years earlier. So here he is with one of his favorite hunting dogs. Here is an interesting take. This is an advertisement for, it's a postcard, commemorative postcard for Tosca, and the characters of Tosca are over here on the left, but above all, what is it advertising? The personality of the composer. There's him in his Doge costume, as you like to call it, on a boat on the lago, about to go duck hunting, one presumes. There he is in one of his speedboats on Lago di Massachucoli. Here we have him at the piano. That's his son Antonio listening to him. Quite a facile keyboardist. Branding also took on the form of creating a distinct and recognizable graphic style. You're all familiar with this extremely famous Turandot poster. By sheer luck, some years ago, we came across a film from the Istituto Luce where the Officina Grafica, they're actually creating the master for the printing of this poster. All of which added to the global idea of a really ingenious modern approach to marketing and publicity to keep opera very, very relevant, even in the early part of the 20th century. But then come future challenges. Radio. Now, I really enjoy this one. This ad is from the 1930 program book announcing the season of the Teatro La Scala, so Puccini has already passed away. But talking about aspirational middle-class values, they're all in evening dress, as though they're going to a theater, but they're sitting at home listening to the radio. He's in a tuxedo, they're in evening gowns. It's all part of the subliminal message, and even not too subliminal. And although radio was not yet a significant disruptive new media in Puccini's lifetime, he certainly heard it, and it would become so very soon. Throughout the 1930s, broadcast radio became an enormous phenomenon. And while Puccini was still alive, it was as disruptive a new media presence looming on the horizon as records had been. In 1921, so Puccini at that time is writing Turandot, he's still very much alive, the first broad-range radio broadcast ever of a complete opera took place from the State Opera of Berlin. The opera they chose to broadcast, Madama Butterfly. So, as we've seen, these potential threats from the mechanical reproduction and broadcast to home audiences would ultimately prove beneficiary to the dissemination of opera in ways that publishers and composers could not have foreseen in the early 20th century. What they had originally feared actually turned out to be a huge boon. It opened up opera to a much broader audience that they never could have imagined internationally. In the top 10 list, as my colleague mentioned earlier, of the most performed operas worldwide in 2023, 4 of the top 10 were Puccini operas: Bohème, Tosca, Butterfly, and Turandot. And according to operabase.com, by the end of 2024, there will have been 971 productions of Puccini operas. That's 240 more than last year, and a total of 2,839 individual performances of a Puccini opera. Puccini, of course, embraced technology in many other ways. He was a very, very avid, in fact, an automobile crash almost ended his life. He was a very, very avid, passionate collector of automobiles. Here we see him in his very first automobile, a 1902 Dédion Bouton, photographed in the courtyard of the old Casa Ricordi production offices. And in the end, Puccini would have been a success in any rate. What is amazing about what we wanted to analyze here as this new take is how these new technologies seemed a threat and were embraced, and also the very interesting analogy to our own times. Think of the beginning of the 21st century with streaming technology, downloads, things that completely disrupted what at that time then was the recording industry. 100 years ago, the same thing was happening back in the 1900s up through 1924. When Puccini died, his estate was valued to be the equivalent of nearly $230 million in today's money, which maybe thinking of some rock stars doesn't seem like a lot, but for a composer of classical music, that was a huge amount of money. And Puccini is said to have owned, over the course of his lifetime, more automobiles than the King of Italy. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you very much.
All right, so now we'll take your questions. So Kip and Gabriella, you can get on stage, and while you're getting going, you mentioned silent films, Professor Dotto, and my mother's mother actually used to play the piano for silent films in 1915, and they didn't tell her what to play. So she would just watch the film while it was going, and then she would make up scary music, or she had a bunch of scary music, romantic music, dramatic music, that kind of thing. So that clearly was not a silent film. It also led to 9 children, 75 grandchildren, 155 great-grandchildren. Something like that.
Complimenti.
Yeah. All right. Perfect. Speaking of kids, here's a question. Was Puccini one of the first of the 9 kids or one of the last, or in the middle?
He was the youngest, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And has anybody said that had an influence on his personality, or the birth order? I remember when that birth order stuff came out, and I have 11 brothers and sisters, and well, they didn't design what the 10th, 11th, and 12th children were going to be like at all. They really skipped something.
He also was the last in a line of several generations of musicians. His father, his grandfather, and his great-grandfather were all very important composers of church music and important organists, and it was seen somewhat as frivolous that he ended up being interested in opera. Going back to something that you had mentioned about the sinfonismo of the early operas, he early on was very, very much in thrall of German symphonic music, was a close scholar of Richard Strauss, and the criticisms of his first 2 operas was that they were too symphonic. They were too overwritten. There was just too much going on, and it was smothering the voices. So that's interesting as well. So there was sinfonismo in his blood too.
Sounds like the Mozart movie. Too many notes, right? So. Next question: who is the current heir of the royalties that Puccini gets? Is there still a family? Is there, or
the last living heir? Now the complicated story is, so Antonio was the son of Puccini with Elvira, and Simonetta Puccini claimed, and the Italian court.
It's the granddaughter, right? Simonetta, the granddaughter.
Yeah, the granddaughter. Claimed to have been the illegitimate... What did I say?
You didn't say.
Simonetta Puccini, the granddaughter, claimed to have been the illegitimate granddaughter of an affair that Puccini had had. And the courts decided that she was right. And so she passed away just a few years ago, and she became the heir to those royalties, which still continue. Turandot is only falling into public domain this year in America, And two of his operas in Europe, where opera's copyright is considered not only for the composer, but for composer and librettists. So whoever the last one that dies, that's how long it lasts. And so Gianni Schicchi and O mio bambino caro is protected until 2040, because he died the librettist Gioacchino Forzano died in 1970, and so is Suor Angelica. So it goes on, and some of the money goes to various foundations, and also the foundation of Simonetta Puccini.
Wow.
Yeah, long legacy.
So here's a question for Kip. Which Puccini opera has been the most popular in San Francisco?
Oh, Bohème, for sure. It's what we have done the most performances of over the years, although we have a long history with Tosca. Tosca was the very first opera that San Francisco Opera, the institution that founded by Gaetano Merla, presented. And it was also the first opera that was in 1923. And then in 1932, when the Opera House opened here, the War Memorial, Tosca was also the first opera that we presented there. But overall, Bohème tops, and if you actually count performances, it's Bohème for sure.
And is there any other composer that has done more, that you've done more of than Puccini?
Oh, no.
Not even close.
Far and away, Puccini's at the top.
Okay. Next question. Given realism, how does this reflect the rising of the 19th century middle classes and mass education? Anybody want to take that art on? We have an art professor in the public here.
How does what?
Verismo, the realism, that artistic trend. How is that reflected in the rising of the 19th century middle classes and mass education? Were they related?
Wow, that's a deep one. Getting back, as I mentioned in my talk, the so-called naturalism was an outgrowth of French literature. Those of you know Madame Bovary or the novels of Émile Zola, trying to really depict real life. And then if you remember Madame Bovary, she takes poison, and we very painstakingly go through her agonizing death in detail. That was sort of the naturalistic idea. Would you translate that into opera? Opera is not a naturalistic art form. It's not. Realism isn't in the sense of, people don't sing, in natural life. In fact, that's I remember there's a famous quote by W.H. Auden who said, "No good opera plot can be truly sensible because people do not sing when they're feeling sensible." So there is an unnatural, unrealistic aspect to opera fundamentally, but what we were getting in the 19th century in the Italian opera was this attention more towards ordinary situations in ordinary life, coupled with this intensity, which resulted in violence often.
And singing.
However, in the same way that fish are not aware of water, if everyone is singing, what would be unnatural is Viennese operetta, where you go back and forth from dialogue, and every once in a while, so then is the progenitor of Broadway. If everyone's singing all the time, then the problem is, if they hear someone singing on stage, there's where you get the dichotomy of early oddity, because I'm singing when I speak to you, and then I hear a song, but that song is not something we're talking.
Yeah, it's outside the context.
As a fish without water.
In literature, the 19th century is well known for going back and forth between realism and romanticism for every 15, 20 years. It just kept popular back and forth. What the irony is for most professors now is that the literature of today and the movies and the whole trend is not even as realistic as the Romantic period in the 19th century. The Romantic period was even more realistic than what we're getting today. So these things, as you said, if the fish is just used to the water, then everybody can get used to almost anything, like superheroes.
Yes.
All right. Next question. Do you have any comment regarding Gestalt and Puccini, given that the form of opera is historically structured during the time of Puccini? Did I get that right, Gestalt?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll leave that one to you.
I would need, maybe, is that your question? Can you?
Form versus function.
Uh-huh.
The form of opera is historically structured during the time of Puccini. Opera took the current form during the time of Puccini. That's the idea.
Well, operas, the structure comes from the literature. Every single one of Puccini's operas is based on a pre-existing subject matter. I think I'm right. Or maybe Johnny Schicchi, no.
No. Johnny Schicchi is an elaboration out of Dante.
Yeah. So that one is more of a elaborate extrapolation of this brief mention of Dante. But I think pretty much all the others are based on, and most plays, almost, theater plays that were presented in legitimate theater, and they have their structure sort of pre-existing, which is modified then for the operas. They have to be cut, of course, drastically. The Sardou, the playwright of Tosca, it's a 5-act play, and the whole second act is taken out because we don't need that to see what happens when Tosca is pursued to her romantic rendezvous and so forth. So yeah, the structure almost always comes from the literary source, I would say.
From a formal musical point of view, what's interesting, and Puccini is in the middle of this process, we go away from, if you go back to the late dramatic works, serious works of Rossini, up through most of Verdi, and there's very, very set structures. And we know how these structures are going to be in the cabaletta, and then it comes back in the ABA form, etc. And then by the time you get the Wagner revolution they're not really recitativi, but there's the through composed idea where the singing is not structured, with a chorus that comes back, etc. And by the time of Puccini, as you were saying, many of the arias are not even structured, so they have an ending where you can stop and clap. And of course, some of his contemporaries, by the time you get into what we consider the true Verdismo, like Leoncavallo and Mascagni, they're really trying to write as though they're ongoing conversations. The idea of coming back and re-singing a phrase just to respect a formal structure is disappearing. Mm-hmm. And so from a formal constructive point of view, they're trying to draw closer to what prose theater would be, but in music, I think.
And there's a connection with Wagnerianism there as well. Wagner, of course, pursued that same idea, that you wouldn't, needless repetition, of course, was not true to drama for him.
That leads right to the next question. How much of a competition was there between Italian and German opera? Or maybe the better question is, who wins that competition? I know we can't ask you.
No. If you ask the critics, you'll get one response, or even the fact that Wagner was such an overwhelming phenomenon that dragged everyone into it. I think the arguments would have been at a snob level, probably, if we take it to the popular press level. Overwhelmingly, the more popular and most performed operas were the Italian operas, all the way up through the 1930s. Again, this golden century that William Weaver referred to also referred to the total proliferation of this repertory. But, of course, they would look at so much of German opera, of course, Mozart at the very top of all that, but even many authors that we today forgotten or would consider minor, were enormously respected for the formal structure of the opera. So the fight would be between what's the most popular in the theaters and what was more respected by the critics. And there's no reason not to admit that many Italian operas were derided. When Donizetti in 1840 went to Paris, and Berlioz said, we didn't invite him, this is an invasion. There were 4 theaters playing his operas at the same time, and he was writing 2 operas on commission, and they were rehearsing 2 more. And of course, he wrote these long bits deriding how Italian opera was written, but it's because they weren't programming his operas.
Yeah.
So that's a problem.
Well, that answers the next question, which is which operas appeal to the intellectuals. So. Well, I'm going to ask this. I'd love to know more about the extramarital affairs of Puccini.
Not in the.
Speaking of the
you've only got-
non-intellectual part of
Let's tell the
You've only
ones.
got 3 hours.
The one story that's worth telling is but there are two that I think about, but the one really actually dramatic one and tragic one is that there was a maidservant in the Puccini household named Doria Manfredini, and Elvira got into her head that she was having an affair with her husband, that she had seduced her husband, and she was relentless, and she drove the poor girl out of the house. The girl took poison and killed herself. And the family sued, of course. Autopsy proved that the young girl was a virgin. And Elvira could have gone to jail, and there was ultimately a settlement. Fortunately, Puccini had enough money to pay the family off. But this was a very tragic. Some of the other episodes of her jealousy are comic, but this was a terribly tragic story.
All right. Just a couple more questions. For both speakers, which one of the Puccini operas is your favorite and why? If you don't want to
Do
say.
we have to choose?
Just don't choose more than 10. Let's put it that way.
No.
If you
it's-
more than 12 and you more than 10.
Right.
It's hard to say. I have two favorites. They all have such fantastic moments, even the earliest operas. Looking from the point of view of someone who was trained as a composer, the most tightly written opera is Bohème. I think Bohème, with the least amount of musical material, which is also brilliant because at a first hearing, so much of the music seems like it's intertwined perfectly, and what you don't realize is the way that he's done this tessellation of musical themes that works so perfectly. There used to be this phrase in Italy: Verdi writes too many melodies, Puccini too few. Bohème is so tightly written, and it's interesting because it was labored over enormously. But the final product that we know is a very, very tight piece of craftsmanship. So I like it for that reason. Another one that is not very popular at all is Suor Angelica. And the reason is two pieces that were cut from Suor Angelica, sadly, because it was not a success at the Metropolitan, and I think it was because deeply misunderstood. They loved Gianni Schicchi, it was so funny, and Tabarro was just so dramatic. It's just it's a noir piece. And Suor Angelica was thought of as something like a Catholic schoolboy's holy card, and completely misunderstanding what the point is that happens. She's hallucinating. I mean, there's not a miracle going on. She drugs herself with herbs that the audience knows she's at once committing suicide and she's drugging herself. So the final is a hallucination. And this piece that gets cut because the conductor said it's too long, so Puccini allowed himself to be convinced for the Rome performance to cut both these pieces. And it's Suor Angelica putting together all the herbs and things. It's called the Ade dei Fiori. It's the most modern piece of music he ever wrote. It's absolutely Debussy on steroids. I mean, it's just, it's some wonderful music. So not Suor Angelica as we know right now, but Suor Angelica, if you were to reconstruct it in its original 1918 version, I really admire it a great deal.
Bohème for me, of course, sentimental favorite. I never get tired of it. It's if there's perfection in opera, it's pretty close. And I do have a very soft spot in my heart for La Rondine. It's Puccini's sort of homage to Viennese operetta. I think it's an underrated piece.
Good point.
Final question. Could you talk a little bit about Puccini's time in San Francisco?
He was not here.
That takes care of it.
But Caruso was here during the earthquake.
But Caruso was here during the earthquake.
Mascagni was here. Mascagni was here and quite famously was chased down the street by a crowd of ladies who thought he was so handsome and wanted to get close to him. To take refuge in the theater.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is great. Lord, I learned a lot.
That was great.